Well, you look relatively normal.
Relatively.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You don't look. You look like a.
There's there's an absence of fangs and stuff. Yeah.
You have both hands.
I have both hands. Actually, I have a third, but I'm just not showing it.
You look well adjusted, and I knew what you were going to look like because I have the photograph.
Right.
I had the photograph.
Right.
I have it somewhere.
Right.
So I wasn't.
You weren't expecting a monster.
No, I wasn't. Before we start, tell me a little bit about the chronology of the books.
Okay.
First of all, the English chronology, and then we'll go to the American. I'm trying to get these squared away.
Okay. 1, 2, and 3 are the Books of Blood. The third volume comes out in October. Were done as volumes 1, 2, and 3 of Blood in England. Now, volumes 4...
No, wait. Now, we're talking about the Berkeley paperbacks.
That's right. They were done with exactly the same titling and exactly the same numbering in English editions.
Were they hardcover?
They were actually a rather odd arrangement in the sense that they began as soft cover and were very successful, and I designed covers for them. They then did them in limited and trade hardback, which then sold out. It was the reverse of the normal procedure. I then did the novel Damnation Game, which Ace hardcover are doing in the spring, which was again very successful, and I was asked to do 4, 5, and 6 of the Books of Blood, which were then picked up by Simon & Schuster, in fact by Poseidon. And Poseidon decided, because they had a slightly different marketing gambit, as is apparent from the two editions you've got in front of you. One was a sort of down market, dare I use that phrase, and one was a little bit more upmarket. In fact, that is volume 4 of the Books of Blood.
The Inhuman Condition is volume 4?
Yeah. And volume 5 will be called In the Flesh, and volume 6 will be called The Life of Death. And that was a device on behalf of Poseidon, I think a good one, to distinguish their editions, which are a slightly different catchment area, I think, in potential audience, even though, in fact, in England they were published as 1 to 6 of the Books of Blood.
Well, you're certainly going to confuse your bibliographers.
It's going to be a pain in the behind for those people. Yeah, in fact, it's made more confusing still because of the backtracking editions. The fact that there were hardback editions after there were paperback editions, which is, I don't know, is that common here? Doing softback and then doing hardback. Doing softback then hardback.
It happens very rarely. The novels, the early novels of Kurt Vonnegut, were initially published in paperback.
Right.
And as he began to catch on as a cult figure, his books were then
that
published
happened with
in
Philip
hardcover.
K. Dick too, didn't it?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think that's right, but it tends not to happen too much. Now, the Inhuman Condition is getting a kind of coverage which maybe, if it had been volume 4 of the Books of Blood, it wouldn't have got, because the hardback carries a certain authority which a paperback doesn't.
Now, I wonder why Poseidon didn't print hardcovers of the first two volumes.
Because Poseidon, you mean Berkeley didn't publish? Yeah, that's Poseidon.
No, why didn't Poseidon publish hardcovers of the first two books?
Because they weren't ever offered them to buy. Berkeley came in very quickly, and they weren't sold by my agent. They were sold by Sphere, who owned the world rights to them, because they were the first books I ever published. And basically I signed a sucker's contract, and they possessed them to sell everywhere this side of Mars. And they sold them to Berkeley because they had quite a tight relationship with Berkeley.
So the deal with Berkeley came before the deal with Poseidon?
Like 18 months before. And then for the second 3 books, because I had a little bit more power by that stage, my agent said, no, you get the English rights only, but we get to sell the American rights. And we went to a number of publishers basically asking what they would pay. And by that stage, Poseidon were talking quite large numbers. So we said, sure, why not?
So number 4 then, The Inhuman Condition.
Yeah.
Will be followed by hardcover editions of 5 and 6, also by Poseidon.
Yeah.
Now, when we finish up with volume 3, in the Berkeley paperbacks, are they finished?
As far as Berkeley is concerned, yes. They are doing Berkeley's hardback, Ace hardback, are doing The Damnation Game, which is the novel that I did between these 2 sets of 3.
Ace
next.
is affiliated with Berkeley.
Yeah, I don't know quite the relationship there, but there's I don't quite know how that works, but they're all in the same building, and so so the Damnation Game will come out in Ace hardback, and then I suppose it'll come out in Berkeley paper at a later point. Simon & Schuster and Poseidon have the Inhuman Condition, and then number two of their selection is going to be called In the Flesh, and number 3 is going to be called The Life of Death. And then in 2 weeks time, I deliver another big fat novel to them. And I think that's it. I get confused.
What's that one called?
It's called Weave World. It's actually a fantasy book. It's not a horror book. It's a dark fantasy book with some monsters in it, with some serious
Now, have
monsters.
all of these books been printed in England?
No, Weave World hasn't been printed. The other 7 have. Poseidon will publish Weave World. They will be the first to publish it because they commissioned it, so they will do it first.
Did you write these short stories
Yeah.
as stories that were to be collected in volumes, or were you able to place them in magazines?
No, I never tried to place them in magazines. I'd never published anything before these books, and so I never published in a magazine or anything, and it never even occurred to me, to be perfectly honest. I saw a book edited by Kirby McCauley called Dark Forces, which is a big volume which contains King and Bradbury and Joyce Carol Oates and Singer and Ramsey Campbell and a bunch of other really top class writers, some of whom are known as horror writers, many of whom aren't. I mean, Singer isn't known as a horror writer, and Joyce Carol Oates certainly isn't. And I think there's 22 stories there in toto, and they are as different as they could be. You know, some of them are comedies, some of them are quite sexy, some of them are sort of black, and so on. And I thought, this is a nice idea. You know, here's a volume which is about horror fiction. It's all horror fiction, but it covers such a range. Wouldn't it be really good to have a go at that? And to sort of see if, instead of it being 22 authors, it was just one. Just seeing how far I could push the horror genre in various directions, you know, into the light, frothy comic stuff, into the dark, heavy, gross-out stuff, into the subtle ghost stuff, and so on. And the consequences, I think, 30 or 31 quite long short stories. I mean,
Yes,
some
they are. Some of them are almost novellas.
I think that's right. And in those 6 volumes, therefore, in the 3 volumes of the Books of Blood and in the 3 volumes of the Poseidon, there's a wonderful line that Woody Allen came up with when he did Everything You Ever Wanted to Know About Sex But Were Afraid to Ask. He said, "This movie contains the 7 funniest things I could think of about sex, including several that led to my divorce." And my idea with this stuff was to write the scariest stuff I could find. You know, the stuff which I wanted to read, and just put them into one. It was too much to hope that they would be in one book, but maybe one day there'll be a volume which will contain the complete short fiction, you know, horror fiction, which would be a lot of words.
Well, that should be long after you've departed this veil. Just like
passed over.
You know, the only book that Shakespeare ever wrote, the collected
That's
plays.
right. That's right.
Shakespeare.
It's a long work, though. It's a long work.
So it's better, it's in terms of being a writer, it's better to have a separate volume.
Absolutely. It's just that the idea originally was, and remains, that that somebody enjoy these pieces almost by contrast with each other. That, you know, you look at this stuff and you read through it and you see that horror fiction is not, as I did when I looked at Dark Forces, horror fiction is not limited to a number, you know, 2 or 3 tones. You can go in lots of different directions, and that's nice. It's always very nice when somebody comes up. I've just been to a signing and people come up and say, "I've read all 6 books," and that's very nice.
Where did they get them? Are you talking about in English?
Black market imports, I suspect.
Taiwan piracy.
That's right, absolutely. Yeah, with all the misspellings that implies. Yeah.
Well, it's inevitable that in this country, since Stephen King is so dominant in the genre, that there is a comparison. But and I've read all of the stories in the Inhuman Condition, and a number of the stories in these other two volumes.
Yeah.
They kind of blur in my mind as to which volume has which stories.
Yes. In
But
mine
I don't
too.
see any similarity because Stephen King is almost a formula that he has. You approach these horror stories in a variety of different ways.
Right.
But he seems to write the same kind of story. Inevitably, the horror is built around an innocent person or family or persons who are then caught up in
Yes.
this episode in ways that they cannot cope.
Yeah.
Almost every one of his stories that I recall is exactly like that. But you have gone off in much different directions, so I don't really see, except that they're horror stories, I don't see much of a linkage there. But I'm sure that as your name catches on, people are going to say, hey, another Stephen King. But if they read carefully, I don't think they're going to find that your stories are much like his.
No, I think there's one thing we do have in common, where both of us do actually care about scaring people, and we do both care about the genre. I mean, I care about horror fiction as a form, and I know Stephen King does. I've never met him, but reading interviews and so on, it's very obvious that he does care about it. He does see it as a place in which he can put his best literary endeavors and his best human insights, and he doesn't at any point write down to the genre. There's never a trace of condescension in his attitude to the genre, and I think that's great, because I think there is a general perception that horror fiction is something of a literary underdog, that it's the last refuge of a literary scoundrel. And I don't feel that at all. I share with him the belief that horror fiction can be witty, elegiac, profound, sexy, funny, whatever else. And I think we have those two things in common. We both desire to scare people, and we both believe that scary material can be good material. You don't have to be a hack.
No, you're going to get this sort of criticism about any genre, westerns, romance,
Right.
books, science fiction particularly comes under fire by especially academic critics.
Yeah.
And it's not fair. You mentioned Ray Bradbury a while ago. He was my link between science fiction and real literature.
Right.
And indeed, he doesn't even write science fiction
But
anymore.
you see, now, even in the way that you phrased that, I think there was a problem.
Sorry about that. I shouldn't have phrased it like that. Yes,
But
that
there was,
not, Well, I shouldn't. Let me rephrase that, because I didn't mean that the way it sounded. He was my link between science fiction and other forms of literature.
Great,
Because
fine.
when I was a
We have no
teenager and
argument.
was reading Ray Bradbury,
Yes.
I was just obsessed by science fiction, and my mother used to say, "That's all you read. That's all you read."
Right.
And in a way, she was right. But he began to go out in other forms and other directions. He was poetic in his writing, and so he made me go off in other directions. So I didn't mean that the way it sounded.
No, though, I think that what was implicit in that structuring, that he was the link between you and real literature, is actually quite a commonly held prejudice, that somehow or other there is genre literature and there's real literature. And
I take that back the way I phrased it. Because
Yeah,
I don't.
Sure, that point's taken on your behalf, but I do think that there are an awful lot of people outside this room who would agree with your first phrasing, that that basically genre literature cannot ever be, by definition, cannot ever be real literature. Now, this is plainly a nonsense, because since the beginning of novels, since the beginning of storytelling, there has been genre literature of various kinds. All the genre literature implies, it seems to me, is that there is a certain class of story which is associated with a certain milieu, which is associated maybe with a certain kind of narrative approach. Now, you may as well say that's true of the Decameron or Shakespeare or Dickens or Defoe or whatever else. I would say that within the mainstream, as it's known, there are quite clearly genres. There is quite clearly a adultery on campus genre. There are quite clearly areas of, mainstream and heavy inverted commas novel writing, which can be split up and can be said to have generic qualities. They have things in common, like the middle-age crisis novel. But nobody calls
Which one is that? I would like to read that.
There's quite a lot of them available. I don't think that there's any. I can see from the publisher's point of view, it's important that you market and that your book in a certain way, and you find a way to promote it that's going to reach its potential readership. However, I think the danger of that, the downside of that, is that you separate the readers off, so that I think and hope that The Inhuman Condition has sufficient literary quality and narrative merit to interest readers who would not ever think of picking up a horror book.
Well, I won't mention his name again, but except this last time, Stephen King. I think there's a difference in the quality of writing. I think that you write more carefully in more of a literary manner than Stephen King, who is obviously a genius, and he's bursting at the seams with ideas,
right, and
he has to get them down on paper, and so he knocks these stories out, and he himself has admitted that his work could stand revision. But he goes on to another one, and another one, and another one. So sometimes he has 3 books a year or more coming out, especially when he gets his old ones out of the drawer and reprints them. Yeah. Peter Straub is another writer who has perhaps not quite as well known as Peter King, but who is more like you in terms of his approach to writing, which is
I'm a great admirer. I'm a great admirer. I used to. It's a great point of pride with me. I used to live, I just moved a month ago, in a house 13 houses from where Peter wrote Ghost Story in London, 13 being a significant number in this context. And I'm a great admirer of Peter's stuff. I'm a great admirer of Stephen's stuff too, simply because he's just, as you say, sort of bursting with ideas, and the stuff is written with such energy. The other thing that, of course, he's done is he's legitimized to a great extent the genre. He's brought the genre out of the cold. And, you can't go to an airport or a railway station without finding somebody somewhere reading a Stephen King book.
Well, of course, there's an ancient tradition of horror, and it goes back many years. And in fact, the early movies are staples on Saturday night. It's a Frankenstein, and Wolfman in London, or is that what it's called? I'm not sure. Dracula, and all of these are not only available as film, but they're available to read.
Yes.
So it's a genre that has appealed to people for years.
I think it plugs in to so many basic anxieties, so many basic fears, and those fears are more or less constants. The format may change. We may look at, I certainly look at Lon Chaney, or more particularly Bela Lugosi, and find it a bit hokey because the acting style has changed and so on. But the dark and losing your life to something that sucks at your neck in the night, that's not going to change as a source of fear. I can't help thinking that in 200 years' time, 300 years' time, whatever, we are still going to be waking in the night worrying about those basic problems.
Are you religious at all?
Not at all, no.
I wondered about that because there seems to me in horror literature underlying religious premise that there is a life after life. And so I just wondered about horror writers and how they feel in terms of mysticism, because either they completely reject it and just write off the wall, or deep within they feel that, well, there is a hereafter, and the hereafter can represent itself in various macabre ways.
I don't call myself religious in the sense that I have no organized religion. I don't go to churches, synagogues, or temples, but I do think that our lives are charged up with all kinds of subtext, all kinds of atmospheres, all kinds of sensibilities which are not available to rational analysis. And if that is a description, as I think it probably is, of a nascent religious urge, then I confess to being religious. I wouldn't call it religious, because religious implies religion, and I don't have a religion. What I have is a sense that the world is strange and elaborate and difficult to comprehend if you simply use your reason. But if you apply principles which may be called poetic, if you apply your subconscious and your imagination to the world, I think it makes more sense than if you try and beat it to death with your reason alone. And I think that is probably the beginning of a religious impulse. I have no urge to worship I have no urge to believe in a deity that organizes anybody's life. I cannot make that work in my head. I can't make that work. What I can believe is that there is system, that there are ways that the world works, that life works, that we are gradually getting hold of. And some of those ways are not ways which a scientist could ever get hold of. It requires a poet to get hold of them, and or even a storyteller. Because I think storytellers are making patterns all the time, and those patterns either seem true or they don't seem true.
And don't forget, there are some very bad poets around.
There's also some very bad scientists.
That's true. Parenthetically, Peter Straub had cut it both ways, referring to what we were talking about with an underlying mysticism. In Floating Dragon, where there was a cloud of
gas.
Gas of some kind, escaping from the laboratory, and the reader was never quite certain whether the horror actually was occurring or whether the gas distorted the perceptions of the people.
Sure. I think there's actually a very noble tradition of such ambiguities, and there was also long been a tradition of, particularly in the movies, of mysteries that seem to be supernatural and within the last 5 minutes get revealed as absolutely unsupernatural. You know, that somebody is trying to drive somebody mad, or somebody needs hold of a will, or whatever else. And there are means by which narratives get set up as apparently supernatural and get revealed otherwise. I never really bothered with that structure, because it seems to me that if somebody's going to pick up a horror book in the first place, they're willing to suspend their imaginations. Certainly, suspend their disbelief, and enter the imagination. Certainly, my enthusiasm is to make that as credible as possible. And I will go to great pains to make the reality of the thing very concrete and tangible. But I don't see... I've never really contemplated the notion of sort of hedging my bets. If somebody picks up one of my books, they're in for an imaginative roller coaster ride, and I'm not going to get them off at the end of it and say, "Well, actually, guys, you know, that was all in their minds."
Now, there's something else kind of interesting to me as I was reading The Inhuman Condition. For the most part, you haven't given away the location. Now, there's one story you've set on the subway train in New York. There's another one that was interesting. It was set in a motel, I believe,
Texas.
in Texas. These stories could be set anywhere.
Yeah.
Now, there was one story in one of the books, can't remember the title, but that was the one where they were doing experiments in the laboratory, sexual experiments.
The Age of Desire.
Yeah, Age of Desire.
Yeah.
And you could tell that was in England simply because when the killer was sought by the two police officers, and he attacked one of the police officers in the boarding house.
Yeah.
They didn't have weapons with them.
Yes.
Now, anybody goes to make an arrest in this country carries a weapon.
End of story. Yes. In fact, later on, he goes to Soho as well, which is clearly recognizable as, you know...
It was funny because the cops said to the landlady who complained about being attacked, "Find me a weapon." Yeah, right. Find me a policeman. Find me a weapon.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. That's part of the thing there is, I mean, there are stories which are clearly set in South America or in Texas or in New York, or there are some which are clearly set in London. There's even a couple which are set in my native Liverpool. But there's a couple in the Aegean and one in Yugoslavia. We spread it over. My concern really is that there are very, very fine and able writers. Ramsey Campbell, for instance, who is a fellow Liverpudlian, who's basically cornered Liverpool as a source of anxiety. I mean, there's very little that you can do in terms of recreating Liverpool as a source of weird events and weird perceptions that Ramsey hasn't already done. And of course, Stephen King has founded Castle Rock as a place where a good deal of his material takes place.
And most of it takes place in Maine, and it amuses me that when a motion picture is filmed of his work, it's set in California.
Yeah, well,
it doesn't match.
That's the vagaries of Hollywood at work, I think. But I've endeavored to sort of spread the locations, in part because I think that it just adds a little bit of local color once in a while to be able to do that, and also because I genuinely do like sort of trying to recreate in my own mind what it might be like in Texas where I have never been, or the jungles of South America, and in part because these are constants. These are stories which, in principle, if they're going to scare you, they're going to scare you wherever they happen, and so it's just fun to be able to do that. I don't think I could ever give myself over to a single environment and just stay there. I have a low boredom threshold for that kind of thing. I want to get out and about,
Liverpool,
Yeah.
as you were growing up, conventional childhood?
Very very conventional. Conventional in the best sense. I mean, not conventional in the banal sense, but just, a good, stable, one brother, mother and father at home, and sweetly loving, and still sweetly
Literary
loving.
family?
Not at all, no. I have a great, great Irish grandfather who's a poet, or was a poet. That's about it. I never read any of his poetry. I don't think it's still around. My father is part Irish, my mother is part Italian. And a very, very conventional childhood. But I always was interested in the imaginative and the outlandish. It always seemed so much more interesting than the life I was living. It still does.
Mm-hmm.
It still does.
Where did you go to school?
I went to school in John Lennon's school in Liverpool. I followed John Lennon's footsteps, as it were.
Talking about the lower grades.
That's right. And then I went on to art college. I was going to go on to art college, and again would have followed in his footsteps, but my parents decided I should do something useful that would give me a job, so I studied philosophy.
Where did you study?
Again, in Liverpool. I mean, I didn't want to go to university at all. I had no desire to do it. I wanted to go to art college, and I got into the Royal College of Art, and then they said, no, please do this for us. Will you study something that, a profession which you will be useful in your later life? And I said, well, I'm really only interested in English literature and philosophy. So they said, do English literature and philosophy, but just get a degree, which I did. And, they were happy with the piece of paper. I've never used it, but it made them happy. And then I went on my own sweet way and went down to London writing plays and doing illustration.
That's right. I was reading in some of the biographical material that you have been a playwright.
Yeah.
So you left college, you went to London and began writing. How did you sustain yourself during that period? Or did you have a couple of big hits?
No, never. With great difficulty. I mean, I managed to sort of hobble from play to play more than run. It was a very tough time, and it lasted a long time because I wasn't actually published until I was just about touching 30, and up until that time I'd been doing plays on the fringe, which is the sort of equivalent of off Broadway, and as anybody who works off Broadway knows, that does not make you serious money. In fact, it doesn't make you money, full stop. And so I was doing some illustration work. And I was writing plays and having a thoroughly good time, but not making very much money. And that was fine because, in fact, my grounding in theatre, I think, has been very important. I think it's affected very strongly the kind of literature that I write and the way that I write it.
Outside of your plays
Yeah.
and the horror stories, have you written anything in any other style?
Well, Weave World is very much.
That's the fantasy.
That's the it's a dark piece, but it does take my work in a different direction, and the plays varied right across the board. Some of them were comedies. I have a play opening in London when I get back called The Secret Life of Cartoons, which is about as far from the inhuman conditions as it's possible to get, and that's a comedy and quite a tender romantic comedy with cartoons, and I've written a couple of Gronky Noel plays. I did a play called Frankenstein in Love, which sort of speaks for itself, a romance, and I did a piece called The History of the Devil, which again speaks for itself, and a bunch of other stuff which is really quite light. So I suppose I've done stuff in a number of tones, but what they have in common is a desire to entertain very strongly. And I think that one of the things about writing for the theatre is that you are made very aware of how very low most people's boredom threshold is.
Well, we're almost out of time, but I did want to ask
Sure.
you, the source for some of the plots that you've developed for your stories? Do you have nightmares in the middle of the night and suddenly wake up and jot them down?
I have dreams which can sometimes offer me scenes, but no, I don't have nightmares. I don't have bad dreams. I don't have bad times. My subconscious is alive and well and living between the pages of my books.
Well, how did you come up with an idea of an army of hands chasing after?
Well, that's an extension from a. I think one of the things I do is try and take ideas to the limits. Whenever I get an idea, I push it as hard as I possibly can to the point where I say, can I get away with any more? And there have been the precedents for that. The Beast of the Five Fingers and the Hands of Orlak. Hands that weren't quite in their owner's control, or indeed liberated and running all over Peter Lorre's face. So there have been examples, but they tend to have been lone hands. I thought it would just be rather fun to push that idea as far as I possibly could until maybe I ended up with 200 hands or whatever. And I do that often, I think, in the fiction. I actually take an idea and just see how far I can push it, and that's an article of faith with me to the limit.
Well, the readers of the Books of Blood and the Inhuman Condition should probably read in the morning so that they can sleep easily. It's really an engaging young man, Clive Barker, and it was fun reading the books, and I know that Americans are going to enjoy them. So
thank you
very much for stopping in.
Thank you.
Are you on a whirlwind tour of the States?
Yeah. Just, it's not so whirlwind. I have 3 days here.
Uh-huh.
Then I go to Detroit and Seattle and Portland and Denver and San Francisco. Yeah.
Nobody reads in Detroit.
Oh ho ho ho! Oh ho ho!
Have a bookstore. Have you ever been to Detroit before?
No, I never have.
You're probably never going to go back.
Okay.
It's even worse than Liverpool. No, Liverpool.
No, don't be like that.
It's quite nice with a history to it.
Absolutely.
Well. But you're living in London now, aren't you?
That's right, yeah. In Wimpole Street, in fact.
Near the Barretts?
Just near the Barretts, yeah. Just round the corner from the Barretts.
Boy, you've been busy then. The last time you were here, you had come out with a book of short stories.
That's right. Inhuman Condition. We talked about that, I think.
That's right. And that was the first appearance that you had in the United States.
That's right.
And I knew you were working on other projects, and since that time you've had the Damnation Game and now Weave World. You've also done a movie.
Yeah.
You haven't been sitting still, have you?
No.
Fill me in on everything you've done the last couple of years.
What have I done the last couple of years? Well, I guess you see, part of the thing is that the American publications of the stuff are pieces that are backed up in England. I'd done the 6 books of blood, and volumes 3, 4, and 5 came out as Inhuman Condition, then In the Flesh, and volume 6 is to come out next year. So they were already around. It must seem to Americans like I'm suddenly producing all this stuff. Where the hell did it come from? And in fact, the books of novellas had been written, now, I guess, 2 years ago. Damnation Game was published in England last year. The year before that, in hardback, and then that last year in paper. And Weave World gets its first American publication on Friday. In fact, it gets its first world publication on Friday. So this is the first time, really, that Weave World is the first time there's a book which is written for an American publisher, explicitly for an American publisher, to be published first in America. The rest of the stuff has been stuff which I produced for English markets, which has been printed over here later. Now we're kind of getting into the correct rhythm, which is that we publish in America first and then in England. And there was the movie in between. I wrote and directed Hellraiser, which is still number 3 at the box office this week, which I'm pleased to see, which is very, very gratifying. It didn't cost too much money. Mm-hmm. I guess we made the money back on that picture in the first 2 days of being out there. It was a real cheap picture.
Well, you're really a man for all seasons.
A man for all seasons, yeah. Most of them dark, but...
Well, you look normal enough.
But Weave World is a new as a new area for me, in the sense that it's not a horror novel. It's not, there isn't that much grisly stuff, and there's some strange stuff, there's some dark stuff, but it's not.
A fantasy.
It's a fantasy book, very much, and that's the direction that I'm going in. The new book is the book that will follow Weave World is a fantasy book. The next movie will be a fantasy movie. So I've very much moved away from the horror stuff, quite consciously. Well, I'd done 7 books of novellas, which is like 500,000 words. I'd done the Damnation Game. I'd done Hellraiser. I pretty much immersed myself in the grisly and the visceral, and felt like it was time to see whether I could do something different. Also, this book, Weave World, had been a dream project of mine for a long time, long before, in fact, I even got the other stuff published. And the couple of projects which I've got coming up, the fantasy projects, are also kind of projects which I've been planning for a long time. So a move into the kind of soaring, visionary fantasy area which excites me at the moment is one which I've been plotting and planning for a long time. Which isn't to say that the horror fiction was simply a route to get to that. It wasn't. I mean, I'm very, very happy to have done the horror stuff. But, if you like, I've done my Titus Andronicus, I'm now on to my Midsummer Night's Dream. I feel like I've shed a lot of blood in the last, fictional blood, you understand, in the last, I guess, 3 or 4 years. And, it's done real well for me, and I'm very happy. But there are other notes I want to, sing, if you like, and the benigner elements of my nature needed
the what?
Benigner elements needed an out. They really did.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's not unusual. The last book that Peter Straub wrote, The Talisman, was a fantasy book, and of course, he initially started writing poetry and straight fiction and moved into the horror, and now he's gone into the fantasy.
Right. And I think Steve King has moved through various areas. Eyes of the Dragon is not a horror novel. He was also part of The Talisman, and you're quite right again, it was not a horror novel. There's a whole area here which is very interesting to me, anyway. This whole thing about what a genre definition is anyway. There are large areas of fantasy in most horror fiction. There are horrific elements in a lot of fantasy fiction. There's a lot of crossover, and booksellers need to be able to categorize books. They need to be able to call this book a horror book and put it in a certain slot on a shelf. But I think there's more crossover than is often accepted.
Do you believe that the person the reader who likes horror, especially your horror, is going to be as adaptable as you seem to be and take to the fantasy?
That remains to be seen. I mean, I'm hoping that I will bring with me from my horror readership people who will, have this new adventure with me, if you like. They're not going to find in Weave World, those people are not going to find in Weave World the explicit violence and, as I say, visceral imagery which they found in my horror stuff. But they're going to find, I hope, compensations in the sense of the bizarre, surreal stuff that actually happens in the book, and it's every bit as imaginative as the horror fiction. It just isn't as violent. The eroticism, which is very much a part of the earlier stuff of the horror fiction, is intact in Weave World, and that pleases me. It's nice to be able to bring a touch of eroticism to the fantasy field.
Well, you gotta have a few entrails hanging out.
Yeah, one or two. I mean, you can't get through 600 pages of an adventure, however fantastical, without there being a little bit of violence. But that's not the aim of the book. The aim of the book is not to disturb and distress, but to offer a kind of adventure which has a great energy and I hope a kind of optimistic vision behind it.
Well, tell me a little bit about Wee World. Here is a quest for this magic carpet that takes you into different worlds. Tell me how this developed in your mind, and tell me about the carpet.
Okay, the carpet. The carpet's always kind of interested me because in a lot of classic fantasy fiction, routes to the mysterious and to the unknown happen through the most conventional means. You you step through a mirror into Wonderland, or you fall down a hole, depending on which volume you're reading. Alice goes through a very simple route to get to Wonderland. In C.S. Lewis's Narnia books, you step through a wardrobe. In other words, the hidden world, the mysterious world, the magical world is very, very close if you just know how to get there. Now, I'd thought for a very long time, wouldn't it be great to do a book in which a world was actually woven into a carpet? So what we've got in this book is a people, the seer kind, who are the last owners, the last possessors of magic on Earth. What they call rapture. They don't call it magic, they call it rapture. The last possessors of rapture on Earth. This is the end of the last century. And they're gradually being destroyed by a force that's just come for them. And they don't quite know what this force is. They call it the Scourge, but they don't know what it is. All they know is that it's decimating them. So the only thing that they can really do is hide. They haven't got the power to fight the Scourge. And they decide to hide in the most commonplace item, a carpet. They decide to weave themselves into a carpet. They weave their flora and fauna, their theology, their philosophy, their landscape, their houses, their children, everything into a carpet. And their hope is that they will reside in that carpet for a little while and the Scourge will pass on by. And the Scourge does indeed pass on by, but a greater threat to their existence appears, the 20th century. And the people, the custodians who are left to look after the carpet, decide that maybe magic doesn't exactly belong in the 20th century and they better keep the seer kind where they're safe, in the weave. And the time passes and the custodians die and the carpet gets lost. So eventually what you've got is a carpet which is in which resides all the magic of the world, all the rapture of the world, all the transforming powers of the world, lost somewhere, until our hero Cal Mooney and our heroine Susanna Parrish, one by chance, one, as it turns out, by intention, discover this carpet in my hometown of Liverpool. A less likely place to find magic, it is difficult to imagine. And thereafter, of course, they've got a problem on their hands. Once they wake the occupants of the carpet and the weave, the Scourge, the creature which came for the seer kind all those years ago, is again rewoken. And so they find themselves also facing Shadwell, the great salesman, the great villain of the book. The guy who cares only to sell this carpet, to own this carpet for a moment and then sell it, to have the power over magic that selling it will give him. And, we've got a battle on our hands, a major battle. This great metaphysical monster who lives in one of the great deserts of North Africa, the Scourge, and Shadwell, the salesman, against two ordinary people in their early 20s who want to preserve magic but really know damn all about it and have to learn very quickly, otherwise they and the seer kind and the fugue, which is the land which the seer kind occupy, will be destroyed.
Well, I don't know how analytical you've been as a writer, but I was thinking, not very successfully, why in the human psyche we have such an interest in horror, fantasy, worlds that take us away from our own. Have you thought about this?
Yeah, I have, and I don't believe they are worlds that take us away from our own. I think they're finally worlds which help us confront our own. I think good fantasy and good horror fiction, good fantastique fiction, by which I mean science fiction, fantasy fiction, anything which is the literature of the imagination, is finally a way of offering metaphorical solutions to the world in which we live. I think bad fantasy is merely escapism, and I use the word merely intentionally. I mean, I mean it as a pejorative. I think any book which you escape into and come out of feeling as though you haven't really learned anything which is going to help you confront the life that you live outside the pages is not a particularly useful or fine piece of work. I think that the responsibility of the writer of fantasy or horror fiction is to actually offer up metaphors which help us explain living to us, explain being to us. And fantasy can be remarkably adept at doing that, because at its best it kind of straddles a sort of dream worlds and the world in which we occupy, the world which we occupy rather, and the that sort of sense of being able to synthesize the world of our imagination, the world of our dreams, the world of our hopes for heaven, and the banality and the grind of day-to-day life, I think is very instructive and can be very instructive and very useful.
You're saying then that fantasy, horror, science fiction, this is not really escapism.
At its best, it's absolutely not escapism. It's offering up metaphors, if you like. To take an obvious example of a legend, if you like, which has shaped our culture, which is in one sense a fantasy, but in another sense it speaks very acutely to us, and a legend which is actually very pertinent to Weave World, the Eden legend. I am assuming, being not being a fundamentalist, that the book of Genesis is not historically true. But the idea of Adam and Eve being somehow exiled from a place of perfection makes some kind of sense to us. It makes some kind of internal sense to us as animals, as dreaming creatures. And my belief very strongly is that what Jung would call the collective unconscious is responding all the time to metaphors and story forms, which can be best placed in fantasy and horror and science fiction, because your dreams, my dreams, we don't dream reality as we're living it now. We dream very elaborate structures, very baroque and extraordinary things, and our subconsciouses find that a good way to explain the act of being on a day-to-day basis to ourselves. Our dreams are a great way to kind of explain living. I think our dreams are a kind of organization of the problems of the day that preceded the sleep that we're having. And in the same sense, I think that fantasy fiction can be an organization.
Now, let me ask you this, as a creature from our favorite country, and having come here a number of times, book tours and this sort of thing, have you noticed any difference between the readers in England of your work and the readers in the United States?
Not really. Finally, the readers, I mean, it's not just readers in England, it's readers now in Japan and Germany and Spain and wherever else. I guess the books are in 10 or 11 languages. The mail I get, once I've translated it, pretty much is pretty consistent from country to country. I find that the kind of people who read horror fiction and fantasy fiction are actually remarkably open-minded people from whatever walk of life or whatever country they come.
Are they younger people?
No. There's a huge age range, which surprised me at the beginning, I must say. I mean, when I would go to signings and there would be people in their 70s with books for me to sign, that shocked me. I had naively supposed that horror fiction was basically, and I'm going back now to the horror books, so I haven't done any signings for Weave World yet. It'll be interesting to see whether that audience is different. But the signings for the horror books, the audiences were, they began around the age of 15 and they stopped just short of death. And it's very exciting to me to feel that a fiction which is all too often kind of dismissed as being a kind of adolescent thing, you'll grow out of it, son, is in actual fact something which appeals widely to both men and women of every age. And what's important about that, I think, is that if it's good fiction, it's good fiction. Good fiction appeals across the board. I think there may be certain kinds of horror fiction, Attack of the Killer Crabs kind of fiction, which is just one, scene of cannibalism after another, which does have a much narrower appeal. But it's perfectly clear from Steve King's sales and fans, and from Peter Straub's and from Ramsey Campbell's, and maybe from my own now, that this kind of fiction, imaginative fiction, has a very broad-based appeal.
Now, you have a ringing endorsement from Stephen King. It said, "I have seen the future of horror, and it is named Clive Barker." Of course, this is on a book that's not a horror book.
That's right, absolutely. Yeah, well, publishers do that.
So have you had a chance to meet Stephen King?
I did Good Morning America with him about 6 months ago, which is the first time I met him, which was a great thrill for me. I had dinner with him the night before so that he could tell me how I should do this, because I hadn't actually done morning television before. He is a great guy, and I feel like he said all these nice things, but finally he's the boss. He's the boss man. He does this stuff so well. He touches so many people across the world. I mean, I don't know how many books there are in print, but it's it's in the many, many, many millions. My kind of fiction is finally very different from his. I think we come at the act of writing fantasy and horror fiction from slightly different angles, and I'm glad of that, because I can't compete with the master. I'm doing slightly different things
with the master, and your work is always going to be evolving, and Weave World shows an evolution in your work, and you might indeed branch out into other forms of literature in the future.
I'd like to do that. I'd like to do some science fiction. I'm doing a couple of illustrated books. The only thing I don't think I'll ever branch out into is reality. I don't think I'll ever come up with a adultery on campus novel, or a male menopause in London novel. I don't think that's in me. But I think the fantastic material offers so many possibilities. Imaginative fiction offers just so many possibilities in all fields, horror and science fiction. And
you realize you created a bibliographer's nightmare. We've got the Damnation Game, that was published by Ace Putnam. And
I know.
Poseidon, I guess they did your... you had who else? So you've had 3 publishers here.
No. Berkeley did 1, 2, and 3 in paperback of the Books of Blood. Putnam, who of course are in the same company as Berkeley, did Damnation Game. Poseidon did In the Flesh, The Inhuman Condition, and now Weave World, and they're going to be doing my new novel as well, the one that follows on from Weave World. But the thing for me is that, and this is what's so great about working with Poseidon, with Ann Patty, my editor at Poseidon. I mean, she says go for it. I mean, I said, look, I don't want to do a horror novel. I want to do something completely different. And she said, let's do it. Let's do it. Finally, as long as the imaginative components are there, that's what's exciting.
Well, Clive Barker, I have to let you go because I know you have another appointment, but my last question is, I think the last time we chatted you were having some difficulty convincing your parents to accept your material, and so I wanted to see if there's been a turnabout in their attitude.
There's been a turnabout in part because there's a few slices of the hometown and Weave World. Cal Mooney, the hero of the book, has a great-grandfather who's an Irish poet. I have a great-grandfather who's an Irish poet. There's a few little personal touches which my mom and dad recognize as being, biographical or autobiographical. Just a few. And I think that's kind of mellowed their opinion. Also, there is no viscera,
There's no man eating pigs.
No man eating pigs, and I think that'll do it every time.
Clive Barker, thanks a lot.
Thank you.